Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is 𝗵𝗶𝗴. I am an award-winning author of fantasy, but when I started writing, I actually started publishing with paranormal romance, and I am going to talk a bit today about why I recently unpublished all of my paranormal romance books. So I've talked a bit before about my publishing journey and how I ended up self-publishing with those books to begin with, and also why I ended up moving away from it and into my true love of fantasy. But I didn't really talk about why I started in paranormal romance to begin with. And part of it was just that I was a new and very inexperienced author. I had been writing for a long time, but I needed something that was shorter than an epic that I could complete, and paranormal romance seemed like a good option. It's a perennially hot genre, even though the subgenres of vampire or werewolf or shifters or whatever varies a little bit from time to time. There's always something that is paranormal that is popular. So it seemed like a safe choice, and one of the things that made it appealing was it had some fantastic elements to tie it back into my love of fantasy, but it was going to be set in the real world, so it didn't require as much world building, which was something I was still working out in my fantasy stories. I had actually started writing my first epic fantasy book, 𝗀𝗶𝗄𝗀𝗀, long before I started writing paranormal romance anything. But I was still new to the part where you have to bring all the world building together in a way that makes sense. So it made sense to get more practice with finishing books by starting with something that was set in a real world, so I didn't have to do all that world building. Over the years, I ended up writing 7 paranormal romance books across 2 series. One of them was After Undeath, and the other was 𝗃𝗲𝘀𝗀𝘀. And even though those are 2 series that are actually connected in the same story world and follow the same rules, they're set in completely different areas and follow different characters. And at first, things went really well. My first book earned back its production expenses very quickly. People seemed to be enjoying it, and I learned a lot from doing those books. But I also learned that romance is a category where you have to be able to write and publish very quickly, and paranormal romance was moving very swiftly in directions I was not really comfortable with. I did my best to keep up and follow my editor's advice, making my books a little bit spicier, but I still couldn't keep pace with the heat level, and I also couldn't keep pace with the speed at which other authors were putting out books. So mine kind of started to fall, and I started having some health problems, so it became really difficult for me to keep up. So at some point I kind of put it on the back burner, and I figured I would come back to the paranormal stuff later. Around the time that I started publishing again in 2020, after I was ready to go with all of these fantasy stories that I had written and completed and was getting edited, I did go back and revisit my paranormal series, starting with 𝗃𝗲𝘀𝗀𝘀. I finished and released the last book in that series. I went back and re-edited and updated all of my paranormal romance books and gave them new covers to try to bring them back to the surface since I was getting back into the game of writing and publishing. But even with the rewrites, the better editing, the better covers, nothing was happening. Nothing I did seemed to gain any traction with these stories, and I think it's just because they didn't quite meet the expectations of the heat levels that paranormal romance had gone to, and just maybe also that the things that I like most about vampire stories are not what other people like the most about vampire stories. And I do understand that your entry point into vampire lore is going to affect that greatly. I came in on the more classical side of like 𝗵𝗵𝗿 and Dracula, so the people who were coming in from the Twilight side were not going to enjoy my work. No matter how much time and energy I put into the paranormal books, they didn't seem to move, and I eventually decided I was just going to leave them to sit, and I was going to go all in on fantasy and just focus on that. But that meant my brand as an author started to change. Not just because I was pretty much exclusively writing fantasy, but because the content in my fantasy books varied pretty greatly from what was in the paranormal romances. For one, not all of my fantasy books are romance-oriented at all. Roughly half of them are. Snake's Blood is pretty heavily love story driven. And of course, Artisan Magic is a series of romantasy books. But Spectrum Legacy has very little romance, and that really only comes in at the very end of the series, the part that I'm writing now, and West King's Heist doesn't have any at all. My fantasy books are also cleaner, and don't come at me for saying that. I know people get upset about that, but the category on Amazon is literally clean romance, so that's what we're going to call it for right now. And while there was some spice in my paranormal romance books, there is nothing in any of my fantasy books. At most, it's fade to black. Most of them are just kisses. So immediately the people who had read my paranormal romance books weren't going to be happy with the content levels in the fantasy books. It wasn't going to meet their expectations, and they just weren't going to have a good time. So having two very different genres with two very different content levels meant I was going to have to split up my brand into two sections. That basically means moving into a pen name, and I just don't have time for that right now. After the books had been sitting for a while and I looked at how much they were earning, I decided the best move was just to stop diluting my fantasy brand, which is much stronger, and remove all the paranormal romance books from sale. There are people who have loved them and read them, and there are people who signed up for my email newsletter because of the paranormal, and they're probably not going to be too happy to see that I don't really have any intention to go back to it. I'm very happy in my fantasy genre, and I have so many more ideas for fantasy books than I did for paranormal, and it just makes more sense from a creative standpoint, a branding standpoint, and a financial standpoint to focus on the fantasy. Another wrench in things was that my paranormal romance books were available wide. I had originally published wide. It was before Kindle Unlimited was even really a thing. So the paranormal romance books were out there everywhere. They were on every vendor, and taking them down to put the books into Kindle Unlimited to try to gain traction that way wasn't really a good option, because I had a lot of libraries that had bought ebook versions, and sometimes even libraries having books that are available in Kindle Unlimited can make Amazon angry. And I wasn't going to do anything to risk their ire and kind of bring consequences down on my fantasy work. The unpublishing process is also kind of slow. Even though it's been several months since I unpublished, there are several vendors that still have the books available, especially those in other countries. So it's not as if it would have been fast for me to take things down from being available wide and put them into Kindle Unlimited anyway. But in the end, this left me with 7 books that are kind of in limbo. It seemed like a waste to have invested that much time and energy into writing that many books and then not have them anywhere. So I decided the best thing I could do was make them available as a free bonus to my newsletter subscribers, because some of them have been with me for years and years, and some of them are new, and even though they're mostly coming on now for my fantasy works, you never know who might want to explore the rest of your back catalog. So for them to be able to join my newsletter and then immediately get 2 full paranormal romance box sets is kind of a nice treat for people who are interested in that. So it gives me something to do with those books that continues to acknowledge their value, and it also lets me give something special to the readers who have stuck with me through this transition from paranormal romance into the fantasy books. I do think I will go back to those books eventually, but it's not going to be anytime soon. But once they're complete, they're always there, so they'll always be available for me to go back, rewrite, revise, bring up to whatever the current standard is for paranormal romance, and then re-release them under a pen name. I think I'll always have a soft spot for those stories. I still feel like the 𝗃𝗄𝗀 series in particular was one of the most fun things that I have ever written, and a lot of the people who read it really enjoyed it. So I guess I'm also happy that I get to keep the books available for those readers, so if they ever want to revisit them, they can get them directly from me. But yeah, that's the short version of the very long conversation I had with my 3-person group chat before I decided to take the books down and work on narrowing my focus to just the fantasy books for now. That's all for today. If you have any questions about the unpublishing process, you can leave them in a comment and I will do my best to get back to you soon. Take care and I'll see you next time.